Hiya guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we're back over on the lathe today, and basically it's coming up to 3 months that I've had the lathe, and I just want to share with you guys my experiences on the lathe, some of the good and bad points I've found about it, and some modifications that I've done and are meaning to do to the lathe. So I hope you find this useful and gives you a good idea on whether or not you're going to buy this lathe and if it's something that you can consider. So, to start with in this video, I want to go through all the things that have gone wrong with the lathe since I've owned it, whether that be breakages, missing parts, or just things that I wish the lathe did and it actually doesn't do. So to start off with, in my initial review, I had this preload nut missing. That basically sets the backlash on the lead screw. So I contacted Warco, and within a matter of days I had the correct nut here, so that was brilliant by them. Without that, they said I could use just a normal M8 nut to get me through it, but I found it kept on unwinding, so I was really happy when that turned up within a couple of days. So the next thing that I've had go wrong with this lathe is when I was turning the stainless steel lightsaber that you can see in a few of my previous videos before this one. Towards the end of it, on the top slide, the little register broke off, and as a result I couldn't use the tool post anymore. So looking at it quite closely, the casting looks really poor on that. It's very porous, doesn't at all look like it's formed that well. So again, I contacted Warco customer services. Unfortunately this time I couldn't prove that this was down to like a manufacturer issue, so I had to pay for a new top slide. It wasn't like a mega amount of money, I think it was about 40 odd pounds. But again, they were quite good, to be fair. I had it within a couple of days and there wasn't really any issues with that. So that's just something to be careful of, that if you're going to be turning some really hard metal like stainless steel, chrome alloy, that you might want to make sure everything is just really tight and rigid and you're not going to get many vibrations, because yeah, that may happen to you. I don't know, it might just be a one-off, but yeah, it's not brilliant. So moving on to probably the worst thing that has happened on this lathe is, again, when turning the lightsaber, the motor actually burnt out. So I've done a full video on me replacing the motor, but it turned out one of the brushes had fallen out and pretty much just completely melted. So again, Warco customer services, they're really good. They sent me a replacement motor in a couple of days and I was back up and running within under a week. But looking online, this is an issue maybe that a few of these lathes have had. Aid's workshop, he had a similar motor fault, and after posting up the video, a few other people have commented saying they've had the same fault. So that's just something to be cautious of on these lathes. Because it doesn't use a brushless motor, it's still got the old-fashioned brushes in. This has got an area of weakness where something can fail. So just be cautious of that, because it's a massive deal to upgrade these to a brushless motor. So I think if you buy one of these, you're going to be stuck with the brushed motor. But other than that, those few faults which I've just gone over, nothing really else has gone wrong with the lathe. So I'll next want to share with you some modifications I've done on the lathe and some future modifications which I'm going to be doing. So probably the biggest modification I've done to this lathe so far is installing an aftermarket DRO. So this DRO was provided by Warco with the impression that it fitted the Warco WM180 lathe, but in fact after reading through the paperwork that they've sent me, it's designed for the Super Mini lathe. But with a few little alterations you can get this thing to work, and I've got to admit this is one of the best things I bought for this lathe. It's so good when you're like wanting to go back to exactly the same positions every time. It's even really good just to measure how far you're cutting into material. You don't have to bother counting the hand wheels, worrying about backlash. It's all digital, and because of that there's more than likely never going to be any error. So if you haven't got a DRO fitted on your lathe, for the sake of a couple of £100, I'd say it's definitely worth it. You know, if you're just doing this as a little hobby like I am, Depends on what your budget is. Maybe £200 is a little bit too much. I think you can get like cheaper ones, but for me, getting one off Warco was just really handy, because at the time I thought it was going to be a straight fit. Turns out it wasn't, but it wasn't that much issue to get it to fit. So that is the first modification I've done to the lathe. So the second modification of what I've done to the lathe is I've just replaced these handles on the tool post and the tailstock lock. I've just used some like mild steel bar, made them slightly longer, and put some black nylon balls on the end. That just makes it, gives you a little bit of extra leverage on the tool post, and again a little bit of extra leverage on the tailstock, and just overall they feel a lot nicer to use than the handles you get originally with the lathe. So going by these handles and how much better they feel, I am going to make some new handles in the future. I'm basically going to replace the these two handles down here. Just the handles themselves, I feel they feel just a bit cheap, bit small. So I want to replace them with some brass handles, which I've seen a lot of people do online. So that is a thing I'm going to be doing in a future video. So that should be pretty cool. Should change the way this lathe feels altogether. So modification number 3. So the back plate used to be really close to the chuck, and because of that, after I fitted the DRO, I couldn't get the full travel anymore because it was catching on the back plate. So what I've done, I've extended the back plate out. I've basically used a bit of mild steel here to space it out down here, and just a spacer block down there to space out that back. So that gives you a lot more room to collect chips, but also it's a lot easier just to get behind and clean everything out. And while we're on the subject of chip collection, it's not really a necessity, but I got myself a cheap baking tray just there, and I just keep that under there, and that basically just collects the majority of the chips, and I can bring that out and just empty them straight into the bin, so I'm not collecting up chips all day. So I think that covers about all the modifications I've done so far. Like I said, I want to modify these handles, so that is something I'm going to be doing. And if I can bring you over, 2 seconds. So I want to bring you over to the tailstock. So the tail support here, or the tailstock, whichever you want to call it, when you wind it out, it has got a readout on the dial, and it has got markings on the quill itself, but I don't find them that accurate. The markings here are really hard to see, and this, if you lose track because of the backlash, then you've sort of lost how deep you're going. So in a future video, I want to modify this, basically using a digital vernier gauge, mounting it on the side, attaching it to the end of the quill here, and then when you plunge into work because you're drilling or reaming, the vernier gauge digital display will give a readout of how far that's moving in. So it's a little bit like a DRO, but just on a budget scale. So that's something I'm going to be doing in a future video. So now I've covered things that have gone wrong with the lathe. I feel like I've also covered modifications I've made to the lathe. I want to go over what I feel this lathe is really good at, and some weak points in which I think it could do better at. So we'll start with the things I wish it could do better. So as for the length of what you can do, I think they say from centre to centre is 300mm. So I always thought to begin with 300mm seemed a bit small, and when I was just practicing on little pieces to begin with, 300mm seemed alright. But as I found out when I was turning the lightsaber, you soon run out of that travel, and once you've got like a live centre in the back here and a large piece of work, you don't have any room to go any bigger. So I really wish this lathe was slightly longer. The super mini lathe which they sell is 350mm. I don't see why they couldn't have made this bed 350mm. You know, I bought this one because it's a lot heavier and slightly wider, so I was hoping it was going to be a lot more rigid, and obviously I've never used a super mini lathe, so I can't compare the two, but I would say the rigidity of this lathe is fairly good. The only time I've noticed it really suffer is when I've been basically trying to part off stock. Even with the carriage locked, I find you still get a bit of chatter. That's with like fully oiling it, going slow, keeping the feed rate down. So something which I've done recently, which I've found has helped quite a lot, I've over adjusted the gib screws, so you can't really move the cross slide now, and that isn't really a massive issue. I never really use the cross slide for cutting tapers at the minute, just because of the work that I've been doing hasn't really involved it. So when I do need to cut tapers, I can slacken these off and be able to move this again. But for now, this is basically locked in place, and that has really helped with rigidity. I see a few people modify these and basically remove the cross slide altogether and just fit it when they need it. So that's something that maybe I'll think about in the future, but for now, just keeping it locked off seems to be working really, really well. Right, moving on to speeds and feeds on the lathe. So when you buy these lathes, they're advertised that they can go anywhere between 50 and 1250 RPM at the slow speed, and 100 to 2500 at the high end. So basically, to do that, you just got to swap a belt over on the back. And to be fair, I found myself keeping down in the low end of the speed settings, just because at the low end on the speed, so we're talking 50 to 1250 RPM, you get a lot more torque than what you do at the higher end. So I did find myself, when I was using it on the higher end, I found myself the work was locking up a little bit. I don't know, it just didn't feel like it had the power there. And as soon as I moved the belt down to the slow speed, it seemed a lot more powerful, a lot more torquey. So since that, I've just kept the belt on that and only ever adjusted it if I'm not getting like a really good finish. That's it really, actually, to be fair. Just if I'm not getting a good finish, I up the speed and just go over with a light pass and just finish it up. But the motor itself, I think it's a 600 watt motor, so it's not a massive size motor, so it is going to struggle a little bit. But to be fair, ever since it burnt out, I haven't had any issues. There we have it then. That is my 3-month review on the lathe, and all the pros and cons I can think of off the top of my head about this lathe. So would I recommend that you get this? Well, that's entirely up to you. What is your budget? That's the main thing. If your budget's about £900, then yeah, by all means, go for this lathe. It's really good. It's a pretty rigid lathe and it's got a fairly powerful motor, even though I did have a little issue with it. But other than that, it's a really good lathe. Saying that though, if you can stretch your money a little bit further, the Warco do, I think it's a 250V, I think it is, or 240V. That's about the £1,800 mark. That has got a lot better features than what this lathe has, but that does reflect in the price. So it's all down to budget really. What is your budget and what do you want to get out of this? If you're only machining fairly small, like model makers parts, then this is probably a really good lathe to go for. And if you're just starting out in machining, then again, this is probably a very good lathe to go for. So I hope that gave you a little insight into the Warco WM180, especially now I've had it 3 months, so you can see exactly how things have fared after 3 months. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, guys.